Hello everyone. Tonight, we will gently slip through the secret doors of history, returning to an era where palaces were thick with the scent of melting candle wax and icy stone, where the fate of an entire dynasty could hinge on the heartbeat of a young girl. Imagine this, a maiden draped in a heavy silk gown, her breath turning to a fine mist in the winter air. As she realizes her life is merely a pawn on a grand chessboard she never asked to be placed upon. Her name was Catherine of Valois. If you think royal life was all velvet and diamonds, this story will make you think again. Amid secret romances, whispered betrayals behind velvet curtains, and a grave lost for 400 years, truthfully, the fact that she even survived her childhood was a miracle. If you were in her place, you probably wouldn't have made it to breakfast. So before you lean back and get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. And by the way, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum. And let's gently begin tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and imagine yourself walking through the cold stone corridors of an ancient castle. The walls rise so high they swallow the light of the candles, leaving trembling shadows stretched across the floor. This is where Catherine of Valois grew up, a girl born of royal blood, but never given the luxury of safety. Catherine was born in October 1401, the daughter of Charles VI of France, a king whose madness could erupt without warning. On the coldest nights, it was said he would run through the halls, screaming that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was entangled in infamous affairs that everyone knew about, but no one dared speak of. When you're a child in that palace, you learn one thing only: silence is the only way to survive. From a very young age, Catherine became a tool in political negotiations. French nobles looked at her and saw a precious commodity, a treaty wrapped in silk. Smiling on command, at 19, she was married off to Henry V of England, the famed warrior king bent on making France part of the English crown. On the night before their wedding, it's said Catherine sat for hours watching the fire flicker, wondering if love could ever grow from fear. But their marriage was no fairy tale. Henry V was a cold soldier, barely interested in what his wife thought or felt. To him, Catherine was living proof that France had surrendered. As they paraded through streets of mud and smoke, the people bowed more out of fear than affection. Strangely, despite living among power and gold, Catherine was lonelier than anyone. Each night, she slept in a vast, cold room, where only the sound of wind slipping through the cracks and her own heartbeat kept her company. But then, everything changed so fast, she had no time to prepare. Just 2 years after their wedding, Henry V died suddenly, leaving her alone with an infant son, Henry VI, who would one day wear the crown but never truly rule by his own will. As a young widow, Catherine was expected to remain a statue, beautiful, silent, and void of thought. But in the long silences of the English court, she met someone no one expected: Owen Tudor, a Welshman with no noble blood, just a humble servant. For centuries, people have debated whether theirs was love or the shared sorrow of two trapped souls. But one thing is certain: their secret marriage was the boldest act of her life. Think about it: a queen, a symbol of conquest, now in love and wed to someone the world saw as insignificant. In the 15th century, that was nearly treason. They hid their relationship for years, afraid of the watchful eyes always waiting for Catherine to slip. But, like all royal secrets, the affair was eventually uncovered, and immediately, scandal echoed through the cold halls. She was called a traitor, a fallen queen. But people forgot that she was once the little girl huddled by the fire, wanting nothing more than the freedom to shape her own fate. On winter nights, perhaps Owen was the only one who saw Catherine not as a throne or a political legacy but as a woman, tired of being a symbol. From that marriage came 2 sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Edmund would become the father of Henry VIII, king who defeated Richard III, ending the bloody Wars of the Roses, and founding the mighty Tudor dynasty. In other words, from a scorned marriage, a new royal age was born. Yet the price Catherine paid was heavy. She died in 1437. At just 35, a death whose cause has never been fully explained. Some say she was exhausted after childbirth. Others whisper of lingering illness that plagued her for years. Whatever the reason, she passed quietly, as she had lived. After the funeral, something happened that even she might not have expected. Her body was placed in a lead coffin and stored in Westminster Abbey and forgotten. For more than 400 years, her tomb was abandoned, unmarked, unnoticed, while her descendants, Henry VIII, Elizabeth, were etched in golden history. Catherine remained just a name in old ledgers. Only in the 20th century, when archaeologists accidentally discovered her remains in the Great Abbey, did the world begin to wonder, how could one woman be both the mother of a dynasty and so thoroughly forgotten? And tonight, as you're listening, whether in a city glowing with lights or a quiet, solitary corner, Catherine of Valois' story lives on, reminding us that even the most forgotten lives can shift the course of history. So, by now you might be wondering, why would a French girl be married off to the King of England? Especially when those two nations once hated each other to the bone? A very reasonable question. Because France and England had been at odds in the longest war of medieval Europe, the 100 Years' War. That war began with ambition for a throne. If you flip through the dusty chronicles, you'll find the name Edward III of England, who claimed to be the rightful heir to the French crown, since his mother had been a French princess. From 1337 onward, the two dynasties clashed. England lusted after France's wealthy lands, and France would never bow. This bust. And both nations were exhausted. Towns were pillaged. Crops died in the fields. And the people went hungry. By the time Catherine was born, France was in utter ruin. Her father, Charles VI, was nominally king, but his mind had so often fractured that Queen Isabeau had to scramble to maintain what little power remained. It was in this chaos that Henry V of England appeared, a young, brave king hailed as a military genius. In 1415, he led the English to a legendary victory at the Battle of Agincourt. The French panicked, major nobles were captured, and all of northern France nearly collapsed. But Henry wanted more than victory, he wanted a crown, a legitimate bloodline to solidify his rule. He knew that with swords alone, the French would forever see him as an invader. But if he could marry a Valois princess, a symbol of the French court, everything would change. The marriage wouldn't be just a union of man and woman, but a clever maneuver to turn an invader into a rightful heir. So the negotiations began. In an ancient castle, English and French envoys sat across from each other, arguing for hours over every line of the treaty. France was desperate for a temporary fix to stop the English from seizing more land, while England wanted official recognition of Henry's claim to the throne. The final agreement was signed in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes. Under it, Henry V would marry Catherine. Her father, Charles VI, acknowledged Henry as heir to the French crown, bypassing his own son, the Dauphin Charles. It was a devastating blow to French pride. But in desperation, Queen Isabeau agreed. You can imagine that night, Catherine sitting alone in a stone-tiled room, hearing that she was to become Queen of England. She was only 19, a girl born into war, raised among her father's madness, and now forced to be the final pawn for peace. But the bitter truth was, no one asked her if she wanted it. To the French court, Catherine was just an escape route. To Henry, she was a legal tether. In that moment, no one spared a thought for the heart of a young girl. Then came a grand wedding. Velvet tapestries stretched from the great hall to the front gates. Candles burned all night, and nobles nodded in approval. They believed this marriage would end all hatred. But history is never that simple. After the wedding, Henry quickly returned to war, leaving Catherine in Paris before bringing her to England as queen. During their short marriage, she rarely saw him. It said Henry was too busy with warfare, while Catherine lived quietly, learning a new language, mastering the polite smile that masked a lonely heart. Then, fate turned its wheel again. Just 2 years later, Henry died suddenly of dysentery. Catherine, only 21, became a widow with a toddler son who hadn't even learned to speak. In that instant, everything the marriage had promised, peace, unity, power, vanished like smoke. Those who once praised her now looked with cold eyes. With no English king to back her, no English army to defend a French crown, Catherine was just a young widow with a child, Henry VI, whom both dynasties wanted to control. Do you see the irony? A marriage arranged to resolve 100 years of hatred between two nations ended up making things worse. And Catherine, who never had a choice, became the tragic knot in one of Europe's longest conflicts. That's why, when Owen Tudor appeared, a man without titles or ambition for thrones, became the missing piece Catherine needed to live as a person, not a pawn. But that is another story we will continue to uncover tonight. So after Henry V's death, Catherine of Valois fell into a strange void of power that no young queen had ever experienced. She was no longer the symbol of England's triumph, nor was she acknowledged by France as a beacon of peace. In the cold gray halls of the palace, she became a widow living quietly among political intrigues, thick as the mist creeping through stone windows. Henry VI, her young son, barely able to walk, already bore a crown heavier than any child before him. He was hastily proclaimed King of England, and then named heir to the French throne. But all of it was just flowery language hiding the truth. The empire Henry V dreamed of was fracturing piece by piece. In those lonely years, Catherine began to notice a man she once would never have dared to look at too long: Owen Tudor. Just a common servant with no title or lands. Owen had no claim to power and no desire for crowns. Some records say he began simply as her household steward, managing her finances and overseeing daily affairs. No one knows exactly when the bond began. Perhaps it was on cold evenings, when Catherine sat alone in her stone chamber, listening to the wind howl through the vents. Perhaps it was the moment Owen bowed to her, his eyes unintentionally revealing a rare compassion in a court full of scrutinizing glances. Or perhaps Catherine was simply too tired of being a symbol crafted by others. The relationship grew quietly. No grand engagement, no political agreements. Just two people, one who had once been forced into marriage to preserve peace, and another who never imagined he'd become the husband of a queen. But in a world where everything was a transaction, this affection, though whispered about, was truly their own. When news began to leak, the English court was shaken. Some called Catherine a fallen queen, claiming she had tarnished the royal family's honor. Others feared this relationship would birth a rogue royal bloodline no one could control. To understand that fear, you must remember England at the time was like a house with a cracked roof, just waiting for the next storm to bring it down. Some records state that Parliament passed a law forbidding Catherine from marrying without the King's or Regency Council's approval. But what piece of paper could truly stop a woman who had endured loss, been used as a tool, and now longed to choose her own fate? They married in secret, no fanfare, no courtly audience, no elaborate rituals. For Catherine, this may have been the real wedding, a choice made from the heart. And from that quiet union, the seeds of a great dynasty were sown. Catherine bore Owen at least 3 children, among them Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor. If you've heard of Henry VIII, king who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth to found the Tudor dynasty, then you know Edmund was his father. This means that from the scorned romance of a widow and a servant, English history veered onto a new path. Imagine, the powerful figures who once judged and scorned her, could they have guessed that the very bloodline they despised would become the foundation of a mighty empire lasting over a century? A dynasty that would change religion, break with the papacy, and lay the groundwork for modern England? But for Catherine, the joy of her small family always came with a steep price. She was never truly left in peace. Rumors and suspicious glances followed her to the end. In 1437, at just 35 years old, Catherine died suddenly. Some say she was exhausted after childbirth. Others that a chronic illness had returned. And once more, her fate was decided by others. Her body was sealed in lead and placed in Westminster Abbey, but then forgotten. No headstone. No worthy memorial. While her son Henry VI wore the crown and lost it amid chaos. And while her descendants built an empire, Catherine lay there quietly, nameless. For over 4 centuries, is there anything sadder than a woman who once stood at the crossroads of historic treaties being erased from memory, and yet, as if fate had finally stirred, she was rediscovered. In 1929, archaeologists stumbled upon her coffin, reigniting all the old questions. How could a queen be forgotten for so long? And when her name was finally placed on a small stone tablet, something simple was restored: the recognition that Catherine of Valois was more than a pawn in royal games. She was a woman who dared to love, dared to choose, dared to do what she believed was right. Tonight, as you lie quietly in the dark, think of Hertha, young girl forced to be a tool, the widow whispered about in shame, and finally the mother who laid the foundation for a glorious dynasty. Her story proves that history isn't only written by those in crowns and cloaks. It's woven from quiet, brave choices hearts that dared to beat for what they believed in, even when the world disapproved. So when Catherine of Valois closed her eyes for the last time, her legacy wasn't just the memory of a daring romance, but 2 sons who would grow up to alter the destiny of an entire nation, Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor. Their story began in one of the most chaotic times in England. When Catherine died in 1437, Edmund and Jasper were still too young to grasp that they carried a rare kind of blood, both royal and unwanted, for many English nobles. They were the result of an unapproved union. Right after their mother's death, the boys were separated from their father. Owen Tudor was arrested, charged with dishonoring the royal family for marrying a former queen without regency approval. It is said he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, while Edmund and Jasper were placed under strict guardianship. Yet fate always has its own plans. Henry V, Catherine's son with Henry V, and now King of England, felt sympathy for his half-brothers. Though Henry VI was weak and easily manipulated, he made a consequential decision. He legitimized Jasper and Edmund, a move that granted them titles and power. In 1452, Edmund was made Earl of Richmond, one of the highest titles. Jasper became Earl of Pembroke, ruling majestic castles in Wales. Imagine it, 2 boys once deemed illegitimate, raised under the scornful eyes of the court, now wearing ermine-lined cloaks and sitting among England's nobility. Edmund, the elder, was described as wise, quiet, and deeply responsible. He married Lady Margaret Beaufort, a young noblewoman who would give birth to their only child, Henry Tudor, the boy who would one day do the unimaginable. But joy was short-lived. While Margaret was pregnant, Edmund was captured in the civil war between the Lancasters and Yorks, and died in prison of illness at just 26. Jasper, the younger, seemed to inherit his mother's unwavering spirit. When the Wars of the Roses erupted, he sided with the Lancasters, fighting to protect the crown that Henry VI was slowly losing. He became not just a brilliant warrior, but the guardian of his nephew Henry Tudor, a child who lost his father before birth. There were long nights when Jasper held little Henry close as they fled through forests, crossed seas, evaded Yorkist soldiers scouring the countryside. In those moments, the history of England quietly shifted, written not with fanfare, but in the silent footsteps of 2 exiles. If Jasper had let go, the Tudor bloodline would have ended. If he had lost hope, there would never have been a new dynasty. But Jasper did not give up. He took Henry to Brittany, seeking refuge in a foreign land. And it was thanks to Jasper's unwavering protection that Henry grew up in safety, receiving an education, being raised as the last hope of the Lancastrians. Years later, When Henry came of age, he returned to England with the determination to reclaim the lost crown. It was 1485, the fateful Battle of Bosworth Field. Jasper and his nephew led an army against Richard III, the last king of the House of York, and as the dawn faded over a blood-stained field, Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. There is something deeply profound. Without the scorned love of Catherine and Owen, there would be no Edmund, no Henry, and no Tudor dynasty. Without Jasper, Henry might have died nameless in a foreign land. After the victory, Jasper was hailed as a great hero, receiving back castles, estates, and the power he deserved. But he never forgot his mother, the woman who defied every rule to follow her heart. And so, from two orphan children hidden behind a curtain of scandal, Edmund and Jasper planted the seeds that would transform England. One died young but left a royal bloodline. The other lived a full life of loyalty, nurturing the last spark of hope. So when Edmund Tudor died in a damp prison cell, leaving behind a 13-year-old wife and an unborn child, no one could have imagined that this child would one day change all of England. Henry Tudor was born in January 1457 in Pembroke Castle, Wales. As the power struggle between Lancaster and York raged like an unstoppable storm, it is said that on the night he was born, cold winds swept the castle walls, and creaking wooden shutters groaned like omens of ill fate. From his first breath, Henry's life was marked by peril. He was the only son of Edmund Tudor, brother to Jasper, one of the leading Lancastrians. That made Henry a target for those wanting to wipe out the House of Lancaster completely. This newborn was the root to be destroyed. But his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, though still a girl herself, had a will of iron unmatched by any soldier. She swore to protect her son at all costs. And Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle, became his steadfast guardian, treating him as the last seed of hope. Before Henry could understand the meaning of family, war had erupted more violently than ever. The House of York defeated the Lancastrians and seized the throne. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became Richard III, the last King of York. During those years, Henry, his mother, and his uncle were constantly on the run, fleeing from castle to castle, then finally crossing the sea to Brittany, finding refuge in exile. It is said that on cold coastal nights, young Henry would ask his uncle Jasper, "Will we ever go home?" Jasper would simply place a hand on his shoulder and say, "One day, all those who stole the crown will kneel before you." It's hard to imagine this thin, exiled boy without an army, without wealth, would one day become king. But it was those years of scarcity that forged an unshakable will. As Henry grew, he began to understand the legacy he carried, the Lancaster blood of his mother, and the Valois line from his grandmother Catherine, once Queen of France. That heritage was both a burden and a source of pride. It gave Henry a mission no one else dared to claim: to take back the crown. But how could an exiled boy with no land and no soldiers dream of the throne? The answer lay in quiet alliances. While Richard III ruled England with an iron hand, many old Lancastrian nobles still secretly yearned to rise again. They reached out to Jasper Tudor, slowly shifting their fragile hopes onto Henry. In 1483, when Richard III was accused of murdering his two young nephews, the princes in the Tower, outrage swept the kingdom. This was the crack in the armor Henry had waited his whole youth to find. He began rallying old allies, gathering troops in France and Brittany, preparing for his return. Picture it, a gloomy August morning in 1485. Henry steps ashore in England with about 2,000 men, mostly mercenaries. To the English nobility, it seemed absurd, a young exile, gone 14 years, now claiming he would overthrow the king. But history has shown, those most dismissed are often the ones who change everything. On the 22nd of August of that year, the Battle of Bosworth Field erupted. Richard III, a seasoned knight, led the elite Yorkist forces. Henry, just in his early 20s, he commanded his army for the first time. The two forces clashed on a dew-soaked field where one dynasty would end, and another would be born. As the battle reached its end, Richard III was killed. Henry was proclaimed king right there on the battlefield, a ceremony as dramatic as it was symbolic. The survivors knelt, planting the red Tudor banner, "A new dynasty had begun." And so, the hunted child became Henry VII, the founding king of the Tudor dynasty. But that victory wasn't won by sword alone. It was the result of 14 years of patience, of long nights in hiding, of Jasper's unwavering loyalty, and the legacy of a mother who never surrendered. Henry VII reigned for nearly 24 years. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of King Edward IV, to end the feud between the houses of Lancaster and York. That marriage was the shrewdest political move of the age. It united two rival bloodlines, becoming a symbol of reconciliation after nearly a century of bloodshed. Under Henry's rule, England began to stabilize. He restructured taxation, reinforced royal authority, and laid the foundation for a state strong enough to rein in the nobility. Henry wasn't a beloved king, he was reserved, cautious, suspicious of conspiracies, but those very traits helped the Tudor dynasty endure in an age of chaos. More importantly, Henry VII left the most precious legacy of all, a stable foundation for his son, Henry VIII, and his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, to turn England into a powerful empire. When you reflect on this story, you see a strange, continuous thread. Catherine, the woman once deemed a disgrace, gave birth to Edmund. Edmund gave England Henry. Henry returned from exile, claimed the crown, and built a dynasty that would reshape all of Europe. If Henry VII's tale is a song of patience and triumph after exile, then Henry VIII's story is a symphony of ambition, passion, and catastrophic mistakes. Henry VIII was born in 1491 at Greenwich Palace. After the Tudor dynasty had firmly taken its seat on the throne, he grew up unlike his father. He never knew what it was to flee, to fear assassination, in marble halls. Henry VIII was raised as a prince of destiny, intelligent, confident, hailed as the perfect heir. It is said that even as a boy, Henry had the sharp gaze of someone who knew he was born to rule. But no one then could have foreseen that this boy would one day change the religion of an entire kingdom driven by love and pride. When Henry VII died, Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, just 17 years old. His coronation day was dazzling. The procession stretched for miles. Church bells rang across London. Red carpets rolled through the streets. The nation rejoiced, believing a new golden age was beginning, the age of a young, strong, idealistic king. At first, Henry VIII was adored. He excelled at horseback riding, archery, music, and poetry, a perfect Renaissance monarch. But slowly, his thirst for absolute power and his obsession with legacy hardened his heart. He married Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. She had been the widow of his brother, Arthur. The marriage cemented ties with Spain and affirmed the Tudor claim. But as years passed, Catherine bore only one surviving daughter, Mary, and that became Henry's nightmare. A Tudor king without a male heir was something he could not accept. On many sleepless nights, Henry must have wondered, was he cursed by a marriage the Pope never blessed? Would the dynasty his father built collapse because no son was born? Then Henry met Anne Boleyn, woman of wit, charm, and fierce ambition. And in a moment, he believed she was his destiny. Anne refused to be a mistress, declaring, "Queen or nothing." No, Henry VIII was so enthralled with Anne that he was willing to burn down every obstacle. He vowed to divorce Catherine and marry Anne at any cost. But the Pope refused, and that refusal changed the course of European history. In 1533, Henry broke with the Roman Church, establishing the Church of England. and granting himself supreme authority in religious matters, all for the sake of marrying one woman. All to have a male heir. Just imagine, one romance, one denial. Split the Christian church in England cracks that would later spark countless bloody persecutions. Henry married Anne, crowned her queen, but tragedy struck again. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. As the years passed and no prince arrived, Henry's passion curdled into rage. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery and treason. On a cold morning, she was led to the scaffold at Tower Green. The blade met her neck with a cold, final sound, ending every dream she had dared to hold. Henry did not look back. He soon married his third wife, Jane Seymour. At last, she bore him a son, Edward. But Jane died just days after childbirth. The palace filled with the scent of white flowers and the chill of whispered prayers. After Jane, Henry married 3 more women: Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. 6 wives each, a chapter of heartbreak and political drama, each a mirror to Henry's deepest fears and hungers. But despite his cruelty, suspicion, and tyranny, Henry VIII left a lasting legacy. He established the independent Church of England. He turned the Tudors into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, and through his children Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, the battle for the throne continued for decades. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he was exhausted, weighing nearly 400 pounds. His legs ulcerated, his heart hardened. But in the quiet night at Whitehall, his final breath ended a life ablaze with passion, vengeance, and colossal ambition. Perhaps you're wondering now, if Catherine of Valois could have seen all this, what would she have thought? She, who gave birth to the Tudors from a love the world scorned, could she ever have imagined that her descendants would defy popes and reshape European history in pursuit of their hearts? Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of the dark, let Henry VIII's story remind you that even the most powerful souls are still the most fragile souls who might burn the world down. All for a love that was never returned. And so, when Henry VIII drew his final breath on that great bed draped in crimson velvet, he left behind not just 6 turbulent marriages or a dynasty fraught with conflict. He left behind a legacy that was strange, complex, and in many ways, unmatched. Perhaps it is this very paradox that makes Henry VIII one of the most extraordinary kings in European history. He was both a ruthless executioner, unflinching in the face of dissent, and a patron of the arts, a composer of poetry and music. In him, ambition and creativity, brutality and romance, coexisted in a character both magnetic and terrifying. If you turn the pages of old records, you'll find that Henry didn't just love power, he loved the image of himself. It is said he commissioned dozens of portraits in the most glorified style: broad chest, commanding gaze, hand resting on the hilt of a sword. It's as though Henry wanted the world to remember him as the invincible king. But more remarkable than anything, and unlike any dynasty before him, was that Henry VIII transformed kingship into absolute power, surpassing even faith. Imagine the era. Europe still steeped in the shadow of the Roman Church. Kings could fight, but the Pope was the ultimate judge. Yet Henry dared to step into the great cathedrals and declare with head held high, "No pope stands above me." That decision to create the Church of England and crown himself its supreme head was the single most defining move of his reign. A religious revolution born not of doctrine, but of heart and pride, and from it followed waves of tragedy. Thousands of monasteries destroyed, countless monks and nobles executed for refusing the new oath of loyalty. And yet, amid the chaos, Henry maintained complete control. He understood, better than anyone, that fear was the strongest chain of loyalty. One decree could strip a man of his lands. Another could turn a rival to ash before the next sunrise. Perhaps one of Henry's most striking traits was his constant ability to adapt. Though infamous for his tyranny, he was not a man who relied on brute force alone. In his final years, as his health deteriorated, Henry became more cautious, sometimes even strangely tender, especially when he thought of his only son, Edward. He was haunted by the fear that, after his death, the Tudor throne would falter. Servants said there were nights when Henry lay awake, staring at a portrait of Jane Seymour's only wife to bear him a son, who died shortly after. In that moment, Henry was no longer a tyrant, but a father afraid his child would not be strong enough to hold the crown. And here we see another layer. Henry VIII was a king driven by the terror of being forgotten. He didn't just conquer enemies on the battlefield, he wanted to conquer memory. Every edict, every palace, every piece of music he wrote seemed to whisper, "I was here, and no one will erase me." Close your eyes and imagine Hampton Court, a labyrinth of power Henry designed himself. Endless corridors, dark wooden walls, vast halls filled with oil paintings depicting his triumphs. It was the place where he hosted banquets that lasted into the next day, drank wine, while choirs praised his victories, but also the place where he signed hundreds of arrest warrants, ending the lives of anyone who questioned royal authority. Hampton Court is the most vivid proof of Henry VIII's complexity, a man obsessed with beauty, yet willing to reduce everyone around him to instruments of power. When Henry died, many breathed a sigh of relief, but they had no idea the storm he started would grow stronger for decades. His break with Rome paved the way for religious reform across England. His paranoia planted seeds of division between faiths, and his desperate longing for a son led to royal tragedies that would haunt his descendants for generations. So when you think of Henry VIII, think not just of a king in a crown, but of a man with a human heart, a heart full of passion, fear, and an insatiable hunger to leave a mark so deep it would survive the fire of history. And perhaps, most astonishing of all, he succeeded. More than 500 years later, the world still speaks his name, still debates him, still films, writes, and retells stories like tonight's to remind us that the greatest power of all is not to rule land, but to rule the memory of those who come after. But beneath all the splendor of palaces, all the hymns, all the proclamations of power, one obsession never let Henry VIII Goth obsession with a son. Now try to imagine that young king, newly crowned, brimming with confidence, convinced that God had chosen him to lead England to glory. In Henry's eyes at the time, fathering a male heir seemed inevitable. He had health, youth, a powerful kingdom, and a noble wife, Catherine of Aragon. Yet, as the years passed, each son born to Catherine died in infancy. The tiny cradles lay empty. The cold stone walls of the palace echoed with brief cries. Then silence. Only Mary, their daughter, survived. It is said that after each loss, Henry was not just sorrowful but utterly terrified. He didn't speak of it, but everyone saw it in his eyes, a growing panic that the Tudor line would wither like so many dynasties before, that all his father Henry VII's struggle seizing the crown after exile and hardship might ultimately mean nothing. Henry became convinced that the absence of a son was divine judgment. Night after night, he lay sleepless in his private chambers, turning the pages of scripture, wondering if his marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, was a sin. Was God's wrath upon his house, taking away each male child as punishment? Each morning, as sunlight brushed the portraits hanging on the walls, Henry stared at images of the Plantagenets, the Lancasters, the Yorkskings full of power, who had crumbled when they failed to produce strong heirs, and he made himself a promise. His name would not disappear from history like theirs. That obsession grew stronger than any affection. It outpaced the love he once had for Catherine, a woman he had once admired, once shared years of happiness with. But as time aged her, and her ability to bear children faded, Henry no longer saw her as a partner. In his eyes, she became the barrier between him and his dream of a son. It was during this crisis that Henry met Anne Boleyn, a young woman radiant with confidence, intellect, and charm, unlike any other. Anne not only reignited Henry's desire but also lit the flame of hope, a young, vibrant wife who could finally give him the son he had waited for so long. But to be with Anne, Henry had to sacrifice everything: his loyalty to the Pope, the honor of his court, and relations with Catholic kingdoms. On restless nights, as wind whistled through the palace, servants said Henry would pace alone, whispering to himself, "I must have a son, at any cost." Oh, can you picture it? A king who had conquered battlefields, who struck fear into his enemies, yet was brought low by the simplest need, an heir. When he thought of death, Henry did not fear pain. He feared the Tudor bloodline dying with him, the crown falling into another's hands, his name fading from the golden annals of history. When Anne Boleyn finally became pregnant, Henry was reborn. For those months, nothing gave him more joy than the thought of a prince on the way. The court prepared for celebration. Churches composed hymns. Metal workshops began crafting commemorative coins. Henry ordered designs featuring himself and his future son, ready to be sent across Europe. And then, the child was born, not a boy. It was Elizabeth, a girl. The shock was like a slow, cold blade. Henry said nothing for hours, staring blankly at the crimson velvet cradle. In that moment, he knew the curse had not lifted. Later, Anne became pregnant several more times, but all ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. With each loss, Henry sank deeper into despair. He began to believe that God had turned his face from him forever. Perhaps that obsession was what slowly corroded Henry's heart, turning him into a man everyone feared, a king who would sign the execution order of the very woman he once loved, most simply because she could not give him a surviving son. And when Jane Seymour finally gave birth to Edward, the long-awaited prince, Henry wept with joy. But that happiness was short-lived. Jane died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry holding his only son in a cold chamber, more hollow than ever before. So after all the grand weddings and broken vows, after beheadings and religious reforms that shook Europe, Henry VIII entered his final years wearing a crown heavier than any sword he had ever lifted. He had what he longed for, a male heir. Edward, a more stable dynasty than ever before, a church of his own making, no longer tied to the Pope. But in return, his body and soul were no longer whole. In his youth, Henry had been the ideal king, tall, athletic, a master horseman, unmatched in sport. But time wore him down. Old injuries from hunting and jousting began to eat away at him. At around age 40, he suffered a severe fall from his horse servants, claimed he nearly died. From that accident on, his leg developed ulcers that never fully healed. That wound gradually turned into a festering sore, agonizing and relentless. The stench grew so unbearable that his attendants had to constantly burn incense and scatter herbs nearby. As for Henry, who once strode with majestic command, he now had to be carried in a litter or rely on crutches. But what eroded him more deeply, more persistently, was solitude. Everyone Henry had ever loved, he had either pushed them away or personally brought about their end. Catherine of Aragon died quietly, stripped of title. Anne Boleyn was executed. Jane Seymour died shortly after childbirth. Catherine Howard, the young wife he had hoped might soothe his old age, was beheaded for adultery. Picture a late night at Hampton Court, a bloated king, sitting silently in a vast room, legs wrapped in bandages, a jewel-encrusted crown still resting on his head, but with eyes more hollow than any beggar outside the palace gates. In those years, Henry became obsessively paranoid. He saw betrayal everywhere in his courtiers' glances, his guards' whispers, even in the wind that slipped through stone windows. Every night, he ordered locks checked, strange footprints examined. No one dared mention the past. No one dared ask if he felt regret. Henry VIII never admitted to fear. But in a servant's journal, a short passage remains that still stirs unease. Last night, the king did not sleep. He sat watching the fire die. clutching his first wedding ring. Was it? In that moment, that Henry thought of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife? The one who stood beside him through youth, who once placed her hand in his when the crown was still light and his heart still unbloodied. But dawn came, and Henry once again wore the mask of majesty. Thrones do not permit tenderness. As his health worsened, he delegated more duties to his advisors, particularly Thomas Cranmer and Edward Seymour. But no decree passed without Henry's final word. He would not allow anyone to forget that even as a 400-pound man with bleeding legs, he alone held the power over life and death. In his final months, Henry barely left his bed. The leg ulcers were infected beyond healing. His breath grew labored, sometimes halting, as if life might slip away at any moment. Court physicians, with their limited understanding, could only mix herbs and pray. And yet, even as death approached, Henry made one last mark. He commanded that Edward be recognized as the undisputed heir. He also requested that the court honor Mary and Elizabeth, daughters he had once doubted, and ensure their succession if Edward should die. Perhaps, deep down, Henry knew he was leaving the world with no way to repair all he had done. Perhaps, for the first time in decades, he was afraid. No more parades. No more trumpets. Only a worn-out old man with a festering wound. Watching the dim flicker of a dying candle, Henry VIII died in January 1547, at age 55. On his bed, surrounded by silent courtiers, no one wept. No one dared breathe too loudly. Later, someone said, Henry died as he had lived alone, with no one willing to meet his gaze. And though he inspired fear, though history still debates whether he was a genius or a tyrant, no one denies Henry VIII changed England forever. Thus, with Henry VIII's death, a long era ended in suffocating silence. His body was placed in a heavy coffin, wrapped in crimson velvet, and laid beneath the stone vault of St. Frapper, George's chapel. The obsession that once burned in his heart for a male heir had finally faded. But fate, as it often does, had its way of mocking even the grandest ambitions. Edward VI, the son Henry loved above all else, ruled for just 6 years before dying young at 15. The crown then passed to Maritha, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and finally, to the daughter Henry had placed little hope in, Elizabeth. If Henry's life proved anything, it was this: no one can predict the fate of the Tudor dynasty. For all the years he obsessed over a strong male heir to inherit his legacy. It was Elizabeth, the daughter born into disappointment, who would carry the Tudor name into legend. Elizabeth was born in 1533, at Greenwich Palace, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. The moment she emerged a girl, all Henry's joy vanished. He had prepared heraldry, medals, and festivals for a son. Instead, he got a daughter. Elizabeth grew up motherless. At just 3 years old, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. From that moment on, Elizabeth lived in a strange limbo, no longer cherished, no longer seen as a rightful heir. Imagine a little red-haired girl in a worn velvet dress, standing quietly in the corner of a room as courtiers passed each, looking at her with a mix of pity and caution. In the diary of one servant, a line was written: "That little princess, she seemed to understand more than her years." In her eyes, there was always something like suspicion, like a question never spoken aloud. Elizabeth's childhood was a long lesson in silence. She was taught to read Latin and Greek, to study music and philosophy, but more than anything, she was taught to hide her emotions. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she knew that one wrong word could cost a life. When Edward VI died and Mary took the throne, Elizabeth stepped into a new role, the suspected. Mary, her half-sister, feared Elizabeth would become the center of plots and rebellions. And Mary had reason to fear, though Elizabeth did nothing to provoke. Protestant nobles opposed to the Catholic regime saw her as the symbol of a new England. In 1554, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had been executed. On rainy nights, she sat alone in a cold stone cell, listening to the drip of water on the floor, wondering if her fate would be any different from Anne Boleyn's. But fate did not repeat that tragedy. After Mary's death in 1558, there was no one left strong enough to contest the throne. Elizabeth, the forgotten child, the prisoner, the underestimated daughter, was called forth to wear the crown. On the day of her coronation, the sky over London was grey. In Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth wore white robes and walked a long red carpet toward the throne. It is said that, at the moment the coronation ended, she gave only a slight smile, a quiet vow unspoken: from this day on, no one will ever overlook me again. The reign of Elizabeth, I would become the most glorious era the Tudors ever knew. Tonight, as you quietly close your eyes, think of that red-haired girl who once trembled in a cold palace, who became the Virgin Queen, the symbol of a proud and powerful England. It is proof that history does not always follow the orders of the mighty, and sometimes it is the underestimated who write the most radiant chapters. When Elizabeth I was formally crowned at the end of 1558, all of Europe watched with the same question: how could a woman daughter of the infamous Anne Boleyn hold the throne of such a divided kingdom? But Elizabeth was no longer the frightened child in the tower's cell. She had learned to wait, to observe, to listen, to conceal her thoughts. When they mocked her for being unmarried, she said nothing. When ambassadors from France or Spain studied her gaze for weakness, she bowed slightly and never let them read a thing. From the earliest days of her reign, Elizabeth understood just how fragile her position was. The country had just endured a decade of instability. Mary's reign left a legacy of hundreds of religious executions. Hatred still simmered between Catholics and Protestants. The treasury was empty. The currency was devalued. The people were weary from the endless changes of kings. Elizabeth was no dreamer. She knew that to survive, she had to be different. Not a ruthless queen who slaughtered rivals. Not a political puppet for nobles to control. She chose to be something harder to grasp, a symbol. She was 25 when she took the throne. Her youth raised doubts, but that very youth, combined with fierce determination, helped her craft the image of the Virgin Queen, a monarch who belonged to no man, beholden to no foreign crown. Imagine those icy winter mornings at Whitehall Palace. While ministers bickered and schemed, Elizabeth sat silently by the window, her eyes distant, as if calculating a game whose moves only she could see. One of Elizabeth's boldest decisions was to remain unmarried. From France to Spain, royal houses sent waves of proposals. Marriage meant military alliances, foreign protection. But Elizabeth knew, the moment she belonged to someone, her crown would no longer be hers alone. She responded to envoys with her now legendary line, "I am married to England." It was not just a political statement, but a warning: do not expect to possess this queen. Yet being unmarried did not mean she was weak. Elizabeth built a vast spy network across Europe, led by Francis Walsingham. Every assassination plot was discovered in time. Over 40 years on the throne, she survived countless conspiracies and threats. In court, Elizabeth did not hesitate to dismiss anyone she distrusted. But she was also wise enough to retain the most capable mindset in those who had once stood against her. It was this pragmatism that slowly brought stability to her government and peace to the people. Under Elizabeth's reign, something miraculous happened. Englanders, exhausted by religious wars, began to revive. English merchants expanded trade routes to India, the Middle East, and the New World. The royal treasury swelled month by month. London became a center for silk, spices, and precious metals. It was also during these years that English culture entered its golden age. The Globe Theatre rose beside the Thames. Shakespeare's plays emerged, weaving eternal tragedies and comedies. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, bringing back treasure and legend. But don't be mistaken, Elizabeth was not a queen without burdens. The shadow of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a Catholic, hovered over her like a curse. By blood, Mary had a claim to the English throne. She became a rallying point for conspirators. From Catholic nobles to Spanish spies, Elizabeth knew the danger well. She did not want to execute Mary. They were, after all, kin. But the years passed, and more plots to assassinate Elizabeth in Mary's name surfaced. Eventually, Elizabeth was forced to sign the execution order. In 1587, Mary Stuart was beheaded. When the news reached her, Elizabeth was silent for a long time. She whispered, perhaps only to herself, "There is no turning back." And indeed, after Mary's death, enmity between England and Spain erupted into war. In 1588, Spain sent its mighty armada to invade England. Many believed this would be Elizabeth's final hour, but in that perilous moment, she proved herself to be the leader England had never known. Elizabeth rode on horseback to the camp at Tilbury, clad in silver armor. Scepter in hand, she told her troops, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England." Those words became legend. And with brilliant naval strategy and a timely storm, the armada was defeated. After that triumph, Elizabeth was no longer questioned. She was not just a queen, she was the living emblem of a free, resilient, defiant England. But despite the praise, Elizabeth carried a deep loneliness. She never married, had no children, and no one truly close. On late nights, she would sit alone, fingers brushing a coffin-shaped ring, a piece of jewelry that reminded her of the cost of power and sacrifice. In 1603, Elizabeth I had died. After 45 years on the throne, on a misty morning, as courtiers knelt around her bed, she whispered, "All has been done." And thus, the Tudor dynasty, born from the scorned love of Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, closed with the calm gaze of a queen who had once been overlooked, once suspected, but who had carried her name and her nation to the peak of history. Tonight, as you gently close your eyes, remember, some souls are not born for peace. They are born to fight, to prove, to leave marks no one can erase. So after more than 40 years of rule, Elizabeth I had seen every height and every abyss a monarch could face. She had been the motherless girl, the princess imprisoned in the Tower of London awaiting judgment, the queen scorned by Europe for lacking a husband and an heir. But as old age came, Elizabeth had become the embodiment of absolute power, a living testament that the will of a single person could alter a nation's fate. Yet that glory could not ward off the quiet shadows that crept around her. In her final years, Elizabeth became a solitary figure in her own palace. The people she trusted most, William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, had passed. Younger advisors whispered that the queen was too old, too stubborn, no longer clear-eyed about England's future. In a chamber lit by candles burning through the night, Elizabeth sat alone before a great brass mirror. In the flickering firelight, her face was marked by deep lines, her eyes able to shake Spanish envoys no heavy with weariness. But who would dare say such a thing aloud, to the court? She remained the Virgin Queen, the immortal monarch who never yielded. There's one little-known detail. For many of her final years, Elizabeth wore a small ring containing a miniature portrait of her mother, Anne Boleyn. That woman, executed on cold stone, remained silently with her daughter in a hidden piece of jewelry. On some nights, the queen would sit for hours, turning the ring in her hand, as if asking herself, was all this sacrifice worth it? Though Elizabeth never admitted it, she was haunted by one thought: when she died, who would keep the crown steady? She had no child, no husband, no bloodline to continue. All her glorious years could turn to ashes if no one strong enough took the throne after her. Beneath the golden sheen of the Elizabethan era, with Shakespeare, Francis Drake, and the victory over the Armada, there lingered silent fears. The English people were changing. A new class of merchants was rising. Wealthy landowners sought to challenge royal authority. and the simmering fire of religious conflict had never truly gone out. One night, Elizabeth called for an old courtier, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We've built this empire through so much pain, but will it survive once I am gone?" It was a question no one dared to answer. At last, Elizabeth understood she would have to choose a successor. She looked around. There were no Tudors left. All of Henry VIII's children had died or been cast aside. Only one remained, James VI of Scotland, the grandson of her sister, Mary Stuart, the very woman whose death warrant Elizabeth had once signed. It was the bitter irony of history. A former enemy would now become the only future of the Tudor line. In her final months, Elizabeth grew visibly frail. She refused to eat, refused to lie in bed, afraid that once she did, she would never rise again. Servants said she sat on the cold floor, leaning against the wall, eyes half closed. No one dared urge her. No one dared weep. Then, on a misty morning in late March 1603, at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I quietly took her last breath. No fanfare, no farewells. Only a long silence, the end of one of the most brilliant chapters in English history. The court moved quickly to seal the palace and spread the news across the capital. During the days-long funeral, crowds lined the streets to glimpse her one last time. Everyone understood. A great page had just turned. And so, nearly 120 years after Owen Tudor married Catherine of Valois, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. But that ending was not a collapse, it was a handoff. It gave rise to a new dynasty, Stuarts, bringing with it hope, power struggles, and the bloody civil wars yet to come. James VI of Scotland was declared James I of England, marking the first time both kingdoms shared a monarch. They called it the Union of the Crowns. But in truth, it was a fragile arrangement. To many English nobles, James Stuart was a stranger. They had not forgotten that his mother, Mary Stuart, once schemed to take the throne. They had not forgotten the years Elizabeth had spent defending England from Catholic influence seeping down from the north. So, though James I sought to rule with moderation, England stepped into the 17th century bearing deep fractures, religion, the power of Parliament, and royal ambition would soon thrust the kingdom into its greatest conflict since the Norman conquest. But that is a story for another time. Tonight, as you quietly close your eyes, think of Elizabeth I, the red-haired girl once rejected by her father, the woman who lived her entire life under suspicion, and who ultimately stood alone at the height of power. She died childless, with no direct heir, but left behind a legacy that would never fade. A more confident England, a wealthier England, an England poised to enter an age of exploration and expansion the world had never seen. And that, too, is the lesson of history. The ones most underestimated often become the very soul of an entire era.